We thought we would start each by reading a small passage. In fact, one from each of the 3 books so far of the trilogy. I'm going to start by reading the very, well, not the very beginning, but close to the beginning of My Brilliant Friend, which establishes the relationship between the 2 women, Elena and Leela. My friendship, it's narrated by Elena. Well, maybe I don't need to say that. My friendship with Leela began the day we decided to go up the dark stairs that led step after step, flight after flight, to the door of Don Aquile's apartment. At some point, Leela gave me one of her firm looks, eyes narrowed, and headed toward the building where Don Aquile lived. I was frozen with fear. Don Aquile was the ogre of fairy tales. I was absolutely forbidden to go near him, speak to him, look at him, spy on him. I was to act as if neither he nor his family existed. Regarding him, there was in my house, but not only mine, a fear and a hatred whose origin I didn't know. The way my father talked about him, I imagined a huge man, covered with purple boils, violent in spite of the Don, which to me suggested a calm authority. He was a being created out of some unidentifiable material, iron, glass, nettles, but alive, alive, the hot breath streaming from his nose and mouth. I thought that if I merely saw him from a distance, he would drive something sharp and burning into my eyes. So if I was mad enough to approach the door of his house, he would kill me. I waited to see if Leela would have second thoughts and turn back. I knew what she wanted to do. I had hoped that she would forget about it, but in vain. The street lamps were not yet lighted, nor were the lights on the stairs. From the apartments came irritable voices. To follow Leela, I had to leave the bluish light of the courtyard and enter the black of the doorway. When I finally made up my mind, I saw nothing at first. There was only an odor of old junk and DDT. Then I got used to the darkness and found Leela sitting on the first step of the first flight of stairs. She got up and we began to climb. We stopped often, and each time I hoped that Leela would decide to turn back. I was all sweaty, I don't know about her. Every so often she looked up, but I couldn't tell at what. All that was visible was the gray areas of the big windows at every landing. Suddenly the lights came on, but they were faint, dusty, leaving broad zones of shadow full of dangers. We waited to see if it was Don Aquile who had turned the switch, but we heard nothing, neither footsteps nor the opening or closing of a door. Then Leela continued on, and I followed. She thought that what we were doing was just and necessary. I had forgotten every good reason, and certainly was there only because she was. We climbed slowly toward the greatest of our terrors of that time. We went to expose ourselves to fear and interrogate it. At the 4th flight, Leela did something unexpected. She stopped to wait for me, and when I reached her, she gave me her hand. This gesture changed everything between us forever.
That's a great passage. I'm so glad you read that. Does this work? Can you hear in the back? No. No. Okay, great. Yeah, that'd be good. Does that work? Better? No. Do we have any other mic machines? We did not discuss what passages we'd be reading, and as it happens, I'm reading from the 2nd book, and this is Leela's ghastly honeymoon, when she has married the son of Don Aquile, the ogre. He leaned over to kiss her on the mouth, but she avoided him, turning her face forcefully to right and left, struggling, twisting, as she repeated, "Leave me alone, I don't want you, I don't want you, I don't want you." At that point, almost against his will, the tone of Stefano's voice rose. "Now you're really pissing me off, Lena." He repeated that remark 2 or 3 times, each time louder, as if to assimilate fully an order that was coming to him from very far away, perhaps even before he was born. The order was, "Be a man, Steph. Either you subdue her now or you'll never subdue her. Your wife has to learn right away that she is the female and you're the male and therefore she has to obey. And Leela hearing him, you're pissing me off, you're pissing me off, you're pissing me off, and seeing him, broad, heavy, above her narrow pelvis, remembered when years before he had wanted to grab her tongue with his fingers and prick it with a pin because she had dared to humiliate Alfonso in a school competition. He was never Stefano, she seemed to discover suddenly. He was always the oldest son of Don Achille. And that thought immediately brought to the young face of her husband, like a revival, features that until that moment had remained prudently hidden in his blood, but that had always been there, waiting for their moment. Oh yes, to please the neighborhood, to please her, Stefano had striven to be someone else, softening his features with courteousness, adapting his gaze to meekness, modeling his voice on the tones of conciliation. His fingers, his hands, his whole body had learned to restrain their force. But now the limits that he had imposed for so long were about to give way, and Leela was seized by a childish terror, greater than when we had gone down into the cellar to get our dolls. Don Achille was rising from the muck of the neighborhood, feeding on the living matter of his son. The father was cracking his skin, changing his gaze, exploding out of his body. And in fact, look at him. He tore the nightgown off her chest, bared her breast, clasped her fiercely. And when she, as she always had been able to do, repressed her horror and tried to tear him off her by pulling his hair, groping with her mouth as she sought to bite him until he bled, he drew back, seized her arms, pinned them under his huge bent legs, said to her contemptuously, "What are you doing? Be quiet. You're just a twig. If I want to break you, I'll break you." But Leela wouldn't calm down. She bit the air. She arched to get his weight off of her. In vain. He now had his hands free, and leaning over her, he slapped her lightly with the tips of his fingers and kept telling her, pressing her, "See how big it is. Say yes, say yes, say yes." Until he took out of his pajamas his stubby sex that seemed like a puppet without arms or legs, congested by mute stirrings in a frenzy to uproot itself from that other, bigger puppet that was saying hoarsely, "Now I'll make you feel it, Lena. Look how nice it is." And since she was still writhing, he hit her twice. First with the palm of his hand, then with the back, and so hard that she understood that if she continued to resist, he would certainly kill her. Or at least Don Achille would, who frightened the neighborhood because you knew that with his strength, he could hurl you against a wall or a tree. And she emptied herself of all rebellion, yielding to a soundless terror, while he drew back, pulled up her nightgown, whispered in her ear, "You don't realize how much I love you, but you will know. And tomorrow it will be you asking me to love you as I am now, and more. In fact, you will go down on your knees and beg me, and I will say yes, but only if you are obedient, and you will be obedient." When after some awkward attempts he tore her flesh with passionate brutality, Leela was absent. The night, the room, the bed, his kisses, his hands on her body, every sensation was absorbed by a single feeling. She hated Stefano Carracci. She hated his strength. She hated his weight on her. She hated his name and his surname.
Okay. I'm going to read from the third volume that just came out, Those Who Leave and Those Who Stay. And I apologize to anyone who's in the room who hasn't already torn through this, because there's a little bit of a spoiler in here. It's tiny, it's tiny, it's tiny. Elena is having a, how should we say, a reconciliation with Nino after many years. She's home alone. Then the telephone rang again. When I grabbed the receiver, I had words on my tongue ready for Leela. "Don't ever concern yourself with me again. You have no right to Nino. Let me make my own mistakes." But it wasn't her. It was Nino, and I overwhelmed him with broken phrases, happy to hear him. I told him how things had been arranged with Pietro and the children. I told him that it was impossible to reach an agreement with calm and reason. I told him that I had packed my suitcase and couldn't wait to hold him. He told me of furious quarrels with his wife. The last hours had been intolerable. He whispered, "Even though I'm very frightened, I can't think of my life without you." The next day, while Pietro was at the university, I asked the neighbor if she would keep Dede and Elsa for a few hours. I put on the kitchen table the letters I had written, and I left. I thought, something great is happening that will dissolve the old way of living entirely, and I'm part of the dissolution. I joined Nino in Rome. We met in a hotel near the station. Holding him tight, I said to myself, I'll never get used to that nervous body. It's a constant surprise, long bones, skin with an exciting smell, a mass, a force, a mobility completely different from what Pietro is, the habits we had. The next morning, for the first time in my life, I boarded an airplane. I didn't know how to fasten my seatbelt. Nino helped me. How thrilling it was to squeeze his hand while the sound of the engines grew louder, louder, and louder, and the plane began its takeoff. How exciting it was to lift off from the ground with a jerk and see the houses that had become parallelepipeds, and the streets that changed into strips, and the countryside that was reduced to a green patch, and the sea that inclined like a compact paving stone, and the clouds that fell below in a landslide of soft rocks, and the anguish, the pain, the very happiness that became part of a unique, luminous motion. It seemed to me that flying subjected everything to a process of simplification, and I sighed. I tried to lose myself. Every so often I asked Nino, "Are you happy?" And he nodded yes, kissed me. At times I had the impression that the floor under my feet, the only surface I could count on, was trembling. So we thought we'd start by maybe just asking one another a couple questions to get the discussion going, and maybe hopefully to say something other than "we love her so much." I just love her so much. So I have a question for Anne. I have many questions. Well, the first question I think that we all want to ask Anne is like, who is she? Where is she? How can we find her? But I actually have a much more specific question, which is, very often in the English translation there'll be parts that say, and he turned and he said to me in dialect, do this or do that, and they go in and out of dialect. And I just wondered if in the Italian, are those sections actually in dialect, or is it indicated in the same way, and he said to me in dialect, because it seems to compose a kind of language within the language that I was very curious about.
Well, luckily for the translator, it's not written in dialect. Can you hear me? If I speak like this? Oh, there. Okay. So yes, it's actually very similar to the English. She says, occasionally there's a word in dialect, but generally she just says, he said in dialect, or they talked in dialect. So it is all written in Italian, or almost all.
In standard Italian.
In standard Italian. I mean, there's some Neapolitan phrasings, and the idioms are different, are somewhat different, you know, in every part of Italy, because they still have different languages. But basically, yeah, it's she says said in dialect.
Okay, so that was what my question was about too, because it is so important a part of this narrative, whether or not they're speaking dialect and what that means about their aspirations, their hopes, and where they are. What can you speak dialect? Can you translate from it? How different is it from Italian? Can you speak a phrase in it?
I can't, no.
But can you talk a little bit about it? What does it mean? I talked to an Italian friend who said when she was growing up, nobody would talk to the people from the south of Italy because there was such a huge social divide.
Well, Neapolitan is a real language, is an actual different language. There's a Neapolitan Italian dictionary, for example. And I mean, there's certain things that are similar. I mean, I can't really, I guess I should have thought about this. You know, if you know, like in some dialects, some letters are just different or sounds are different. I think Neapolitan is a little more of a different language because it's got, actually in something of Ferrante's that I just translated, a little passage of from this book, La Frantumaglia. It's just a little essay. She talks about how Neapolitan has layers of many other languages, French, Arabic, Spanish, others, which I can't remember now. But anyway, it's a language that's had a lot of influences. So that's all of that is important, and it is the language of the poor people.
Yeah, so it's always class marked.
It's so very yes.
Yeah. So Neapolitan, is that the same as dialect?
Yes.
Okay. So
yes. When she says dialect, she means they're speaking in Neapolitan.
Okay. So the Neapolitan dictionary would not have been what the Neapolitan king spoke when there was a king of Naples, or you don't know? Just trying to mark it.
Yeah. But it's definitely a class identifier.
Now it is.
I mean, because the people. Well, I mean, at the time that she's talking about, obviously, when they're growing up. Yeah, very, very much that. Because, I mean, she talks about. I mean, they learn Italian in school. They don't speak Italian at home.
Yeah, yeah. Is it like Catalan? Is Catalan to Spanish as Neapolitan is to?
I don't know. Yes.
Someone there knows. Okay.
No, I don't know.
Okay.
Does someone know?
How many dialects are in Italy? Because there's, I mean,
Oh.
Italian is the Firenze dialect of Dante.
There are many dialects in Italy. I don't even know how many, but every region has a dialect. I mean, that are more or less like Italian and that are more or less dying out as well. I mean, it's more than an accent, I guess I would say.
And I have another translation question. Does it move as fluidly between present and past tense as it does in the English? She sort of sometimes she slips. Yeah,
it does. It's complicated sometimes because it's hard to know whether something that seems natural in Italian seems natural in English. I hope it does, but it's hard. And that's one of the hard things about translating, I think.
Is she, for a translator, is she easier than other Italian writers?
No.
Harder then.
Yes, harder than a lot of Italian writers. I think because of the intensity of the language and the sort of. I mean, it sounds odd to say, but I think that the piling up of emotion somehow makes it hard to get the words right. And to get them to read well in English. I mean, we all know the Italians are very emotional. But, so I think it's hard. I mean, harder than some others. I mean, the other person that I've been translating a lot is Primo Levi, and it's a completely different experience. I mean, the scientist and the novelist.
Interesting. Yeah.
Not that he's cool, but compared
he's
to
orderly.
Yes,
rational.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And actually, I should say that Ferrante is not unordered. I mean, her disorderliness is very orderly.
Yeah. It's a kind of an emotional velocity that she has.
Yeah.
So, do you want to?
Yeah, no, go ahead.
So Stacey, I wanted to ask you, because of your name, I know that you have some Italian background, and so I wanted to know what your feelings were about this Italian writer. Do you have any feelings of connection, and if so, could you talk about those?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I was thinking about that because the Italianness in my life has been very important, and yet I never write about it. I never speak about it. I seem not to think about it that much. I'm Italian on my dad's side. He's second generation, and obviously, well, not obviously, but from a working class background. And it was interesting when I've been tearing through these books, and I grew up in Maryland, these are not my neighborhoods, these are not my, right, this is not my family, and yet there is something about these people and about their ethics, their values, the ferocious gender storms that rampage through these books that is very familiar to me. And I do feel that in a way I'm learning some of the cultural currents that formed my father and my grandfather, and so I do feel a connection to it through that, and it certainly makes me wonder why I never write about this, why I never bring this experience to the page for which I have no answer, except that, as I was telling Ann and Roxana before, my father was just here, and we were talking about my grandparents, and although they both must have been fluent in Italian, they were immigrants and they never spoke one word of Italian at home, not ever. It was, so they did the immigrant thing of like, we're here, that's it. So it was as if between the two of them, there was probably a secret language to which none of their children had access and none of their grandchildren. So it is a little bit like going back into a world that I wish I had had more access to, this kind of working class Italian life.
Well, my question for both of you is to go back to the question of Ferrante being anonymous. What would do you have an idea of what your novels would be like if you were anonymous? Do you have your...
That's such a good question.
Yeah, maybe that's what we should do.
Yeah.
Or just confess that we actually wrote those books.
Yeah.
You can, now the secret can be told. Yeah, it's a very liberating idea. I mean,
that's how Ferrante feels it.
Yeah, she may. I mean, there's so many questions about her anonymity, and she raises them in the books. I mean, there's all this part of the plot in which the Leela vanishes, and the manuscripts are destroyed. So there's this constant stream of questions about identity and presence and anonymity and vanishing. So she's asking us to ask these questions, and asking what it's like to be a writer who's concealed herself. I mean, one of the interesting things is because these books are so savagely full of emotion and detail and somebody's background. She says they're not autobiographical. I don't know if we're going to believe that. Clearly, we're not meant to believe everything she tells us, but. There is a sort of feeling that she has exposed, whoever this writer is, has exposed so much of a life and other people's lives that it would be almost dangerous for her to step out onto the stage.
Well, that's the conceit, and I mean, you know, among other things, it's one of the best PR ploys ever. And, you know, there's nothing more exciting than if you can't see who the person actually is. I mean, I think that Roxana is right that I agree that the sort of the penumbra that it sheds on these books is that now the truth can be told, right? So I don't know. I'm trying to think if there's anything I haven't. Maybe it would be Italianness. I don't know, that I would feel more free to write about if I weren't using my own name. And I'm not sure exactly. But I do know that it absolutely adds to the mystique of the books to feel that someone is telling you something that they would never tell you directly, which is wonderful. Although it leads me to another question that I actually have for both of you, really for everyone, which is, what is it about these books that inspires such passion in us? Because when I think about them, we all say, well, or many of us say, well, we've never read anything like this before. Or, we're reading things we've never, you know, she's saying things we've never heard before, but that's not actually true. We've read stories of women's lives, of passionate friendships, of oppression, and yet what is it that feels so alive and so new about what we're reading what we're reading. I don't know if you guys have thoughts about that.
Well, as I said in the review, I think that for me, obviously there's this sense, this tremendous emotional presence and a kind of nakedness that Ferrante delivers, but also there's this sense of incredible rage and passion. So the sensibility here is someone who's deeply connected to a sensual life, but also just seething with rage at the life that she's been given. And I read Ferrante wrote an op-ed piece in the Times about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and it was about a subject that I would never have expected to see in the New York Times. It was about a garbage strike in Naples. And I don't know why the Times thought it was something that all their readers would want to read, but it's ravishingly interesting because she's so enraged by the fact that, and it's the same message that these books deliver, which is that the people of Naples are treated like trash, and no one thinks that their streets need to be clean. It all has to do with the Camorra, it all has to do with payoffs, and the people are the ones who pay. So it's partly about passion, these books. I mean, what draws me is the passion in them, but it's not just the passion of family and sex. And she also sort of inverts that. So, as I said in my review, she creates out of the domestic world something completely the reverse of what we expect from a woman. And she reveals the domestic world as an infernal place, a region that is intolerable, for the reasons that we've described. That opening scene in which the two girls are playing with dolls, which ought to be a fairy tale story. A charming scene with an older gentleman who restores their lost property. It's a terrifying scene, and what Anne didn't read, one of the things she left out of that is, as they're going up the stairs, they're listening to people cook, and she imagines, the narrator, Lenu, imagines that they are going to, she hears the sizzling of oil in the frying pans, and she imagines Don Aquile's wife is going to pluck her from this darkened staircase and drop her into the frying pan, and they are going to kill her by frying her, and they're going to suck her head the way they suck a cooked mullet. So the images that she starts off with are so devastating and horrifying that she puts you in a place. Yes, she's writing about women and men and difficult marriages, but my God, it's on a level that we really never have seen before, I think. And she equates crime and marriage in a way that I've never seen. Right? This is the mafia.
Yeah. No, I mean, I do think it's I guess what's different is the intensity of it. I also think that the description of the friendship between the two women, from when they're very young to when they're old, is also something that's unusually detailed. And I think that's something that people don't really write about so much, or not in that way. I think that's very compelling to most of us women. So.
Yeah, I mean, she seems to go. I've been thinking about it a lot, and in anticipation of coming here. And I mean, I think that a part of it is the writing about class, which is so unbelievably powerful, and the costs of assimilation. But I think also it's the fact that she's incredibly detailed about the profound ambivalence between Elena and Lila, or Elena and Lena, and that ambivalence never ends. It's never resolved. It keeps on. It's like a war that's never, or an affair that's never over, that just keeps flaring up again, so that it's like an argument that's never won between them. And I'm not sure that I've ever seen that ambivalence explored so open-endedly and in such incredible detail. I mean, it's fascinating. And Lena as a character, she keeps on popping back up in this way that is both, it's kind of terrifying and victorious at the same time. So So that definitely feels very, very, very new.
Yes, I agree with all of that. Another thing that strikes me about it is, particularly for Americans, and we've all been raised on this notion of being able to, you know, you're on the land of America, you can achieve whatever you want, no matter how poor your circumstances, you can get free education, you can become who you want. And the message in these books is that never happens. That Leela, who's we're told the smarter of the two, is prevented from even finishing elementary school, and that's something that she can't ever get past. She can't. We're shown her as this, as Stacey said, a tremendously victorious, triumphant character filled with vitality and the knowledge of men and how to deal with people and to get around anything and to learn anything, and yet she can't ever, ever, ever get out of the muck of the Naples neighborhood. And that's a story that we don't have in this country, and it's devastating. I mean, you know what I'm saying. It's not meant to be. Of course it happens here, but that's not the American story. No, sorry, I didn't mean, no one ever has any trouble in America. No, I mean, that's not the way we tell our American story, so it's shocking in that way.
I think I should also talk about the language as being part of what's amazing about her, and perhaps as part of why people read her so avidly. I do think that what I was saying about the sort of rush of language, and the rush of events. I mean, because you could almost say, well, these are really kind of melodramatic, but they're not, because the language is so embodies the events. I mean, I guess that's the way to say it, or perhaps the events embody the language, but I think that that's a really an important part of why she's such a good writer. Somehow she is able, I mean, it sounds a little banal when I'm saying it, but the language matches what's going on. The emotions, the events, the details of the emotions and of the emotional events.
Well, and she's also, you know, she's mad. She's like a total terrorist with the comma. I mean, you could just write an entire like essay on. She is just completely bold with the comma. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, she wields it. I mean, she's just absolutely fearless, which I assume is true in the Italian as well, too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the comma, I mean, to me, that's like one of the most radical things she does, that she's just like, I'm just going to fill these sentences up with commas, and we're just going to, like, you know, cover a couple years and these, like, huge expanses of emotion. I'm just going to throw another comma down. It's unbelievably, I mean, she's really a rule breaker in ways that I can only assume. I mean, in Italian they have periods and semicolons too, and so it gives you the feeling that someone, you know, they're just breathlessly telling you this in a rush, and it's actually very consistent across all three books, which I assume is in the Italian as well.
Yeah.
Okay, Noreen asked us to stop around now and see if you have any questions. Oh, great.
Can I start? Yeah. I have a question, which is the books to be, it's not only the personal stories that are so compelling, it's that it is also a story about Italy at a particular time in its history, where there was a great upheaval and a great sense of both people being empowered and powerlessness. And I wonder, Anne, if you could speak a little bit about that sense she has somehow in the language, she keeps you always very rooted in the story of these two women, but somehow the whole scope of Italian history at that point and Italian politics at that point is present.
Well, I think in the third book particularly, that's where it really becomes much more present, because she's in the places where all the politics are going on. I mean, in Milan, somewhat in Florence, in Florence, but I think, to me, what was, and this isn't really answering your question, But I think what was so great about it is that she's not. Well, then there's also the Leela's part in Naples, where she. Am I doing something wrong?
No.
There are the two parts. There's Elena in the north, who is sort of a housewife, but who is on the edge of these politics. The way it just seems so realistic to be someone who isn't. I mean, she kind of knows what's going on, and she is kind of involved in it and cares about it, but she's also very involved in her own life, the way many of us are involved in. I mean, we know what's going on, but the politics are kind of not really they're not our lives. I mean, for some people they are, obviously, but I think that's a really amazing skill that she has to give you the sense of the politics, but to give it to you from just this, well, you could say very narrow point of view. Whereas Leela in Naples, it's a little more direct in terms of the strikes, and the fascists are much more open in Naples, and that's. But it's also in a similar way. It's just from one person's one small point of view. You don't get somebody saying this is what was going on, and I think, but you do get a very real sense of what's going on just from that sort of small vantage point. I think that's a really, it's kind of almost ingenious the way she does it. So I guess I haven't really answered your question, but.
Yeah, you have.
I just want to know what it would feel like for you writing that. I mean, translating, were you exhausted? Did you feel
Yes.
Did you feel also sort of come into her skin in a way?
I do, and I was saying to somebody, the question is how I felt while I was translating these books. And I felt like I do feel when I'm in the middle of them that I'm living in that world, and I mean, I have to walk away from it sometimes. I confess, it just gets to be too intense. But then another thing is when I'm done, I say, wait, where are they? So, yes.
Yeah?
Yes, I would like to suggest that we have met this kind of protagonist before. I'm referring specifically to Olga in Days of Abandonment, and it seems to me that she's an archetype, much like Medea. And in fact, the whole book is really, could be a template of Medea. And I do wonder whether in any of your communication with Elena Ferrante, whether the ancient Greek tragedies ever came up.
I actually have hardly ever communicated with her directly. I usually communicate through the editor, the publishers in Italy. I think she has said that she was a classicist. I mean, she had a classical education, so certainly that would be in her mind. I mean, somewhere in her conscious or subconscious.
It's an interesting idea. Yeah?
I was one of those who was led to this by Noreen Tomasi, and in reading the first volume and into the second, something else was happening also that helped transfix me besides the great writing. And it was that for all the last couple of centuries or more, the gap between the aristocracy and the plebes in Naples has been broader and deeper than in any of the other major cities of the peninsula, at least. And this was reinforced, and recently, Croce in scholarship, Malaperte in novels, and so forth, tended to reinforce that rather than bridge it. But it seems to me, I think that her novels are a kind of historic moment. I think that she is creating here a bridge. I can picture those Neapolitan aristocrats reading about the Rione and being educated themselves. I think this is going to be marked as one of the important steps in bridging that gap, that huge social and cultural gap between the aristocracy and the plebes in Naples. And I wondered if you felt the same.
I don't know.
That's a great observation. Thank you. Yeah.
I have a question, but I just wanted to quickly answer for me, Stacey's question about what you love so much about the book.
Yeah.
What I loved so much about it was being with Elena's voice, specifically being between the voice of Elena, the author in Toto, and Elena, the thinker in the moment.
Yeah.
In the moment, you also brought up ambivalence. The book really, for me, exists in questions, in doubt. The main mode is questioning and worrying and doubting. Yet, Elena, the author, is composed, clear, orderly.
Yeah, I think that's really, yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I just want to quickly...
Yeah.
Later in the third novel, she discovers feminist texts and becomes a feminist writer to some extent. And my question is Elena Greco's voice a feminist voice? Is this novel a feminist novel? Is it not only a very important political novel, but also like a feminist buildings roman that's very significant?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was thinking about that
Can you
because...
repeat the question?
Oh. Well, okay, it's a really long question. Jeff's question was, he was talking about the construction of Elena Greco's voice, the overall voice of the book, and also and that it's so transfixing, and also asking, are these feminist novels, right? And that's a really interesting question because I was thinking about that. What I was thinking about was the fact that it's absolutely true that there is, in the scenes, all of the scenes that we read, which we picked, slightly randomly, are such incredible high emotion, right? I mean, huge. And yet, it's absolutely true that the authorial voice always seems to be standing a little bit beyond it, saying, this is what I felt then. In that scene where she's taking off in the plane with Nino, there's you can feel the shadow already of some distance, some irony, as they take off into their fantastic Hollywood ending. I think that she does something very, very, very subtle here, which is one of the things that we all find so compelling. Yes, sure, on one level they're feminist, they're feminist novels. Both of these women are struggling against a really horrifyingly patriarchal and class-based system, but also because of the ambivalence, they're really also post-feminist novels in that they're saying none of these paths actually work. Liberation doesn't work, oppression doesn't work, sleeping with the enemy doesn't work, not sleeping with the enemy doesn't work. There's a kind of a deep and ironic sense of, we tried all these ways to break our chains, both Lena and Elena, because Lena's really, really, really scrappy, especially in the third book. She's basically going to take out the factory owners, right? And yet there's this sadness that suffuses, I think, all three books, the sense that there was the path of neither woman was a surefire liberation. And what does liberation even mean? And so in that way, I think that we get both the pleasure of the straightforward feminist read, but we also get the pleasure of the post-feminist read and the complexity of that. I don't know if that answers. Do you guys?
Yes, that's
yeah. I mean, they're certainly informed by feminist ideas that as Stacey said, this is the worst patriarchy we've ever read about. And she also finds there's no solution.
Well, and in those...
But the rage, I think, is what defines it then for me as a feminist.
Because the thing was, I felt the anger, but I also feel this other thing, which is ambivalence or doubt. And that seems there's a very strong, a very forceful ambivalence, a very strong doubting.
Well, and what she says in those sections where, all the women in Naples are having, consciousness raising and everything, and she's like, yeah, I went, but I don't know. I didn't know if I really was, so into it. And also, I didn't want to talk to them about my private relationships with men, for instance. So that there was a kind of a zone of privacy where Elena was like, that's not your business. And I'm not talking about that with you, ladies in Naples. And you can hear a little class bell ringing there, too, right? So, it's not like she's wholehearted in her early feminism either. She's a little bit, sorry.
All the way back.
This conversation makes me wonder.
Could you speak louder?
The conversation makes me wonder.
We'll repeat it.
How the books have been received in Italy by critics, by women. Have they caused a stir?
Yeah.
Does anyone know?
The question is about how the book's been received in Italy. Have they caused a stir? Critics, women. What is the response been?
Do you want to answer that?
She has always caused a stir in Italy, and possibly more so with the earlier books, with the Days of Abandonment. These books, in some ways, have caused less of an affront, and they've been seen more as, or she is being seen as one of the sort of the great chroniclers of recent history in Italy at the moment. So the reaction has been more of that nature rather than, the stir that she created with the earlier books.
Why is that?
I'm not sure if I can answer why.
He's saying that the stir created by the Days of Abandonment in Italy was greater than the stir caused by this tetralogy, and that she's always caused a lot. She's always gotten a lot of attention in Italy, but we don't know why exactly.
I assume. I mean, even in this discussion, you've talked about so many different levels of reading of Ferrante, and I get the feeling that in Italy they will also move through levels of reading, and perhaps the first reaction that they've had has been that of seeing a chronicler of course, of feminism and of two friends growing up and of Naples and all the things that we've been talking about. But there has been a lot of focus on her capturing what has happened in the latter half of the 20th century in Italy, like no other writer has, with the possible exception of Elena Ferrante, which is not great.
Everyone else in the room may know the answer to this question, but how anonymous is she? I mean, can we assume that Ferrante is a pseudonym? Or is it just that we don't know where she's living right now? Or?
So the question is, how anonymous is she? Is Elena Ferrante her real name? How deep does the mystery go? And also, where is she? And can you go visit her?
I believe that Elena Ferrante is not her real name. I actually don't know who she is or where she lives. I think it is known that she grew up in Naples and lives somewhere in the north of Italy, but I think not much more is known except by the publishers of EO, who are her Italian publishers. So, as Stacey put it, I have plausible deniability. So I have really scarcely ever communicated with her directly. And I don't think anyone has, except her publishers. Well, and the people in her real life. But I think that she's very anonymous. Yeah?
In the last book, when she's in the factory and their factory is attacked by fascists, I was thrown by that. Was that interchangeable with the Camorra, or were they really political fascists, as I might have known them from the early 20s fascists? Are they still, were they operative at that time as fascistic? Or were you saying when they're moving the workers?
Well, as I understand this, do you want to answer it? Or?
Can you repeat the question?
The question was the political disturbances and whether they were created by actual fascist movements and groups or whether it had something to do with the Camorra. And as I read this book, what Lena discovers is that the violent component in those political disturbances came from the Camorra. And that was when she thought she was moving into another way of living, and it was political and it was intellectual, and it was going to be a useful sort of world to move into, she found that she was pursued by the neighborhood even there. And it was the Camoras who were the thugs, the Camoras who would initiate violence at the protests. One of the things that I just learned about these books, which maybe all of you knew, was that the last book, Those Who Stay and Those Who Left, refer to two titles of paintings by Boccioni, who was one of the futurists. So I thought that was quite interesting, and all educated Italians know that, maybe not all educated Americans. And the Futurists, as you all know, were a very stylized political group in the, say, the 20s. Artists who were famously misogynist, interested in violence and speed, so that for Ferrante to choose those titles, I thought was quite interesting as a reference, cultural reference. Yeah.
I heard there's going to be a volume 4. Has it been written and translated yet, or is it just planned?
It's coming out in Italy in the next couple of months, and it will come out here next year.
Okay, thank you.
No.
Since you haven't had much contact with Ferrante yourself, as a translator, is it a relief to you to be working with a contemporary? Because when you translate a contemporary author, there's a bit more risk of negotiation with that person, especially if they understand English. And then that probably does, maybe not.
Yeah, she reads English. She reads English.
So is it, how do you react to that? Is it a relief? Do you wish that you could get more from her?
The question is about the relationship with an anonymous, of a translator and an anonymous author. I mean, I guess I sort of like that she's anonymous in some way. I mean, I assume that if she didn't like something, she would complain. I mean, I would learn that she was complaining. But I guess I've gotten used to working sort of by myself. Or maybe she's just in my head. I mean, she is very much in my head. So, yeah, I don't know what it would. I can't imagine what it would be like actually at this point to have the real person.
I just wanted to ask if any of you have spent any time in Naples and whether you have a desire to go now, or perhaps not a desire to go.
I spent some time in Naples and was lucky enough to have Shirley Hazard as my guide, which was one of the great events, but we also did things on our own, and we were robbed in quite a violent way on our way down from the wonderful museum on the top of the hill, and apparently that's a famous way to get robbed, and we fell right into it, and it was quite dramatic.
But that's also in the great tradition.
It is in the great tradition, exactly.
Yeah, Shirley's husband.
Well, it was very different from that. No, we were trapped in a taxi by two people on motorbikes who then came into the taxi with us and ripped things away from us. It was much more violent. But it's a very beautiful city, and when we saw it, which was about 10 years ago, it was sort of in ruins, falling apart, but very beautiful with extraordinary art and extraordinary architecture, and Shirley was a great, great guide. So I wish we had Shirley here tonight. She would be the perfect fourth voice.
I would just say, speaking of Shirley Hazard, that I also was able to go to Naples with Shirley, but that she's in a way my inspiration for all my Italian work, even though she's not here. I would say I would pay tribute to her.
I didn't go to Naples with Shirley, but I would. If she called, I would totally go. I've never been. Its reputation is of being quite dangerous. But sure.
Not if you carry things in a plastic bag. I will leave you alone.
Okay. Okay.
Not necessarily.